thank you very much, Mary. So firstly, I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone really oops, goes my microphone already, at Aleksanteri for the opportunity to be here for 1 month, and particular thanks to Ava for organising everything so wonderfully, and to Mary for being a fantastic host as well. And it's really nice to continue cooperation with colleagues who are based here, who I've been working with for a number of years now and hope to continue doing that. And as Mary mentioned, so I'm just finishing a 3-year postdoc at the University of London. So what I'll talk about today is mostly based on research that I've been doing within that project, which I'm hoping to develop a bit more and then hopefully scale up into a much bigger comparative project. And I'm a political scientist, primarily working on public policy and comparative politics in the post-Soviet region. And also, as Mary mentioned, I'm soon to be starting a new position at the University of Liverpool in the politics department there. So that will start in about 2 weeks, which is coming up very soon. And my PhD looked in more detail really at this idea of social rights in Russia. So things like the right to housing and the right to education and healthcare, things like that. And that got me very interested in social policy really more broadly. So what people's expectations are of the welfare state in Russia, are those expectations being met? What is the government's approach to this very important kind of field, policy field, which has a large number of political kind of implications as well as the purely socio-economic ones. So in terms of the structure of what I thought I'd talk about today, and this is a paper that I'm working on, and one thing that I would really like to hear your thoughts on is, at the moment I'm worried it's maybe a little bit too big. That maybe it needs to be kind of broken down perhaps into 2 papers. So I'd be really grateful for any thoughts that you might have on that. But I thought I'd start with giving quite a general sort of context and framework to this idea of welfare governance. Obviously, not everyone will necessarily be familiar with that as a concept. And related to that, this idea of outsourcing social services to non-state actors, so-called non-state actors. And then I thought I'd talk a bit about the relationship between social policy as a kind of policy field and the role it plays within authoritarian regimes, of which Russia is one example, but by no means the only one. And then to be a bit more specific from there, to talk about how it fits into Russia's political system. And then a little bit of background on the welfare reform process in Russia, mainly because, again, it may not be familiar to everyone. And then I'll talk a little bit about, just very briefly really, about the methodology that I've used and the research questions that interest me. And then I'll move on to talk about some of the findings from this project. So looking at the role that non-state actors play within welfare governance networks in Russia, and then the idea of outsourcing and how that's been received or interpreted by different interest groups, network actors and so on in Russia, and then finally just some fairly brief conclusions and some thoughts about where I might like to go with this. So this is very kind of public policy focused, so I apologise if it's not super interesting to everyone. But the idea of governance in itself, but also governance networks, is the idea that we need to, and really this is a process that's been happening for at least the last 30 years, if not longer, but the idea that it's not really enough to look at just kind of government and the institutions of government if you want to understand how political systems work, but also particularly how policy is made and delivered in different types of regime. And so really, in order to get a better sense of how policy making works, and that could be within the welfare state, but also all kinds of areas of economic and social policy and so on. It's the idea that it's no longer just about government, but it's also, there are all kinds of other actors and sectors that are becoming involved in both developing but also implementing different types of policy. And it's really the idea that these formerly quite strict boundaries between the public sector, the private sector, and the voluntary or third sector, that those boundaries have become much more flexible, much less clear. And it's also the idea that in order to understand how these kind of policy-making processes, systems really work, you have to look at the interplay between various different aspects. So you have to look at the actual kind of formal processes of policy-making and implementation, but also who the different actors are who might be involved, might have an interest in that policy domain, and also, of course, what the institutional setting is, because that can very much shape what gets on the agenda, what's discussed, and how different actors react to it as well. And related to this kind of idea of looking beyond kind of just the sort of basic institutions of government is a kind of response to new public management reforms, which became very, very popular in a very wide range of different regions and contexts, really from the kind of late 1970s onwards, but which particularly took off in the late 80s to early 90s. And you can see these types of reforms being used a lot, particularly in liberal democracies, but by no means exclusively, and also in things like World Bank policy towards transition and developing countries as well. So it can happen at the national level, but also at the kind of international development level. And what these new public management reforms usually involve is the idea that central government should no longer be the kind of the focus for things like implementing public policy and so on, that much more should really be, in terms of budget and so on, should be devolved to local governments in particular, but also really strong emphasis on privatisation, usually. So that's privatising all kinds of state assets, so that could be things like railways, for example, it could be hospitals, healthcare, it could be higher education. There's a whole range of different goods and services that can be privatised. And related to that is this idea of outsourcing. So rather than the state delivering and funding all these different social services, that you actually get non-state actors to come in and kind of do the job for you, in a sense. And also this idea that if you promote competition between these different types of provider, and also between different state agencies within the government, that's also a way to kind of drive up efficiency, better kind of use of public money, that kind of thing. And there's all kinds of ways that these reforms kind of take shape, but one example would be voucher schemes, where people who use a particular service, so it could be, for example, kindergartens, one kind of fairly popular way that this has been done, where the people whose children go to the kindergarten are given vouchers, which they then take to the kindergarten that they want to use, that they think is the best option, and then exchange that for the provision of services. And really what this is all about, or at least in theory is all about, is about kind of reconstructing the ordinary citizen as not just a kind of passive receiver of public services, but as a consumer. So it's very much being painted as a kind of choice agenda, that you can choose the best organisation, the best provider of the service that you need. It's not just the government telling you this is what's on offer and that's all there is to it. But it's also expecting people to be much more active, to accept the very strong role of the market in terms of delivering social services, in terms of how welfare and well-being is shaped in daily life, but also that you, as again the kind of ordinary citizen, have to take some responsibility for your own well-being and your own welfare, which is quite a big shift. And as I said, this is very much kind of has long been the case, many decades now, in a number of countries around the world. But what is quite interesting to me is the way that some of this discourse is now appearing in the Russian context as well, and particularly at the kind of government level. And so the kind of product of all of this is that you end up with this so-called mixed economy of welfare. So again, in the past, if you look at kind of Keynesian economics and so on, it was much more the state as the kind of primary source of funding, but also service provision, and that's no longer the case. You have a whole range of different providers. And the key idea is that really the state is kind of withdrawing from the welfare state, and in that sense it wants to promote the use of non-public, non-state partners, because again, they are seen as contributing certain kind of positive things, but it's also, the welfare state itself is being diminished, and that these organisations can kind of perhaps step in and provide some kind of relief for that. And it's worth pointing out that non-state actors is a very broad term, so it can include all kinds of different organisations. So it could be NGOs, which I look at particularly in this paper. It could also be for-profit enterprises, and often is. It can also be community-based organisations, faith-based organisations like the Orthodox Church in Russia, which has been very active in this field. It could be families, very important, always a very important source of welfare informally. And it could also be private philanthropists. And it's worth pointing out that in the Russian context, all of these types of non-state actors have a role to play and do play a role within social policy and welfare provision. And again, social services is also quite a kind of broad term to use, but in this context, it's usually divided into services that are provided for adults, so that could be care homes, it could be home-based help, it could be all kinds of different types of work with people with disabilities or the homeless, or particularly people who are job seeking after unemployment. And then the other kind of side of that is child and family services, so kind of fairly obvious, I suppose, but that could be support of a kind of range of different types for children who also have disabilities, who may be at risk, and also things like care homes. And again, in the Russian context, that's particularly important because Russia still has a very extensive system of mostly state-run orphanages, something that Mary has worked on a huge amount, and so that's another kind of additional aspect that's important to bear in mind. So in terms of why these organisations might be kind of drawn into the welfare state and welfare provision, it's not all about just the kind of cost cutting or efficiency idea. It's also because non-state providers, particularly NGOs, but by no means exclusively, can in theory, or at least in the kind of ideal world, should be able to provide some kind of experimentation, perhaps more innovative practices, approaches to quite complex social problems, and they, in a way, they stop the state from kind of monopolising delivery, and this is seen as being particularly important in areas such as support for people with mental and physical disabilities, where sometimes the kind of one-size-fits-all approach that the state has a tendency to take, although it doesn't always take, is seen as being less effective, less helpful. There's also this idea that NGOs and private enterprises may actually be better at identifying what people really need, because they're a bit kind of closer to the sort of ground level. They may be more trusted by the people, by the kind of clients using their services, although in the Russian context that's not really how it works. But also, of course, the idea of cost is very important, and they are seen as being more cost effective because, particularly for NGOs, they tend to rely quite heavily on the use of volunteers. And rightly or wrongly, that obviously means that the cost is going to be less because you're not paying people's salaries necessarily. So that's the kind of positive side of why states may want to bring in these non-state providers. Having said that, and again, this because this policy has been around for so long and been implemented in so many different national and international contexts, there's been an enormous amount of criticism of it as well. Does it actually really work? And the answer is kind of, well, not really. So first of all, I think we have to really try and question this idea that it's actually really appropriate, because it's fine to have, for example, NGOs in place to provide additional services, small-scale services, and so on. That's absolutely correct. But the problem comes when they increasingly take on functions that the state really should be providing. And there's an argument about kind of people who are paying taxes in particular perhaps have a right to expect a certain level of state-based service delivery. And increasingly you see this rhetoric of this idea that it should be the community and third sector, voluntary, charitable organisations, whatever you want to see them, that they should be really the kind of the basis for public welfare. And it's just, this is very much a kind of neoliberal approach, but it's seeped into all kinds of other kind of ideas as well in politics. And many would argue that it's actually a tool really for governments to increasingly limit the state's role in welfare provision. And actually, although they talk about empowering citizens and giving them choice, that actually it may have completely the opposite effect. And there's also the issue of non-state providers, and again this particularly happens to NGOs, but can affect for-profit organisations too, that they may be encouraged to work in areas which politicians find too expensive or too difficult to really deal with themselves. And that could be all kinds of, one example would be things like addiction, for example, or all kinds of cross-cutting social policy issues, which may not be politically expedient for governments to tackle directly, so they kind of offload that onto somebody else who's also less accountable in many respects. But it also means that government doesn't have to then provide a kind of political solution to these social problems. So in many respects, you can see why governments would be kind of quite keen on this, I guess. And for NGOs specifically, it puts this whole issue of kind of contracting and bidding for tenders and so on in social services, puts them in a really difficult position, because on the one hand, part of their mission is often to advocate for the interests of their clients through trying to influence government policy, but then they're also becoming service providers, they're also subject to that policy. So it really puts them in a very kind of difficult position of trying to combine those two things, and really the chances are that one of those things is going to suffer, and it's probably going to be the kind of advocacy element. There's also this idea that this kind of so-called contract culture and the increasing emphasis on value for money, and the fact that contracts are often quite short-term, and if an organisation doesn't deliver, they will lose that contract. Means that actually NGOs, non-profits are really being forced to act like kind of regular businesses. It becomes very profit-driven, it becomes very efficiency-driven, and again, that may take them further away from what their original kind of mission and role was. And for me, one of the kind of key arguments is that yes, on the one hand, as I said, they may offer services that may not otherwise be provided, that may be useful, that may be beneficial. But these are very limited organisations often. Their capacity is quite low. They often only cater to certain groups within society, which they can choose as well. They have discretion over that. And so in that sense, using non-state actors to deliver welfare can actually lead to much less equitable access to social services. So that's, a real, in terms of, if tackling inequality is one thing that, is of interest to a government, then this is potentially not particularly helpful. So that's the kind of general sort of context. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about the role that social policy, in a broad sense, plays within authoritarian regimes, because this is a really kind of important, for me, very interesting area, which tends to be a little bit underplayed. So, of course, we understand that in, for example, liberal democracies, social policy can play an important role in that governments which are seen to be failing, perhaps, on social indicators can then be kicked out at the next election. And of course, that's not how it works in more authoritarian types of political system. So, the way that Russia is usually conceptualized as a kind of political system is as not just a kind of standard authoritarian regime, but as an electoral authoritarian regime, which I'm sure is a term that everyone is familiar with, but just in case you're not. So the idea is that in this particular case, this is a kind of subset of authoritarian regime type. And the idea is that authoritarianism is practiced behind the facade of representative democracy. So you have all the kind of standard things like a parliament, and you have regular elections, and you have parties, and you have a separation between the executive and the legislature, and all the kind of standard things, but they just don't work in the same way that they would in a kind of standard democratic system, that they play quite different functions which don't really represent people's interests. And within the Russian context, very much, it's the idea that you have elections which are important and are contested, although they may be important for different reasons to a democracy, but you also have very pervasive political clientelism, corruption. It's a very patronal system, and so you end up with this kind of hybrid of democracy and then also some elements of autocracy as well. So quite a mix. So in that sense, Russia is not the same as many other different types of authoritarian regime. However, if you look broadly at this idea of an authoritarian system, it's quite clear that repression alone is not really enough to ensure that a regime can stay in power. You need other tools. It's tends to be more sophisticated than that, not always, but tends to be. And so you start to see the use of the so-called authoritarian bargain, which is where the state, the government, provides some element of redistribution to its citizens. So that could be direct or indirect payments, transfers, could be subsidies for things like housing and so on. It could be lower taxes, higher pensions, a whole kind of range of different things, in order to secure and maintain their loyalty to that system. So in that sense, it plays a very important kind of function, the whole range of different kind of social policy and economic policy tools. And one thing that's quite interesting is that if you look at Russia and China in particular, which are obviously different types of authoritarian regime, but nevertheless authoritarian, is that while it seems quite clear that, at least at the moment, they're not necessarily becoming more democratic, they still have a very strong interest in the market, in a successful and thriving economy, in providing public goods, so things like welfare and social services at a lower cost, ideally, to the state. And so they have increasingly become interested in collaborating with social organisations, private sector organisations, and so on. And there's been quite a lot of research done on China in this field, where overall Ingo Bode, who's written a lot about this in the Chinese context, has been very clear about saying that it is very much about providing public services at a kind of cheaper price, right? So that's really the kind of main motivation. And they also work very extensively with different types of NGO in China to deliver these services. And you can also see a similar kind of phenomenon in Kazakhstan as well, another example which I'm very interested in. And one thing that's useful for these regimes, but also you can see very much in democracies too that use this type of system, is that if you use NGOs or businesses to provide a service, if they then provide a bad service, you can then blame them for that. You don't have to take responsibility yourself, which is something that's quite appealing to politicians usually. And there was quite an interesting article that came out last year by a group of researchers looking at very specifically at governance within Russia. But one thing they pointed out is that if we look at kind of authoritarian regimes and the very kind of top level of government, and we assume that in, for example, the Russian context, that everything kind of depends on Putin, him alone, you really miss quite a lot of what else is going on within that system and within kind of the policy making field. And the fact is that the state is limited in some respects in terms of what it can do, and these types of regime really do rely on other actors to provide goods and services that the state thinks is important, but also that citizens in particular really value. So I guess that's the kind of, one of the key things that I'm interested in. And if I think a bit more about social policy within Russia more specifically, you can see a lot of those things kind of playing out, the importance of social policy to the regime. And particularly during the Soviet period, there was this idea of a kind of social contract that became very popular in order to explain why there was a sort of fairly low level of resistance to the regime, why it stayed stable for as long as it did. And this is essentially what I mentioned. It's just a form really of that authoritarian bargain. So the idea is that people will give their loyalty to the regime in exchange for stability, essentially, in exchange for relatively decent living standards. So that means things like relatively secure employment, again, provision of social services, subsidised housing, all of those things. And so it means that what it's trying to do is sort of take politics out of the equation. And some would argue that a version of this type of social contract is very much kind of in evidence in contemporary Russia as well. And it's also worth pointing out that for the Russian regime, it's always had quite a strong emphasis on social populism as a tool to, again, kind of maintain power. And that means that social issues are of real interest to the regime. And Linda Cook and one of her colleagues, who I think is going to be here next week actually, have written very recently about this, exactly this idea of the social contract under Putin particularly, and they call it's more now a kind of market social contract. So it's much narrower than the previous Soviet version, and it's much more targeted And so what they argue is that it's targeted towards so-called state-dependent social strata, so that's primarily older people. People who the regime counts on in order to stay in power. And also people who are more likely to turn out and vote for the party of power, in this case United Russia. So this means that it focuses, or has focused at least up until now, very much on things like pension provision, so increasing pensions, increasing coverage of pensions and so on. Also some subsidies towards those working in industrial employment. Some healthcare changes as well, increased spending to some extent. And also, and this fits more with the kind of traditionalist kind of approach to the family and welfare and so on, but also increased benefits for maternity and families, particularly couples who have 3 or more children in particular. So that's kind of part of the system as it works now, but one thing that has been pointed out in terms of how policy making works, not just in relation to social policy, but in general in Russia, is that, and this is something that Andrei, who's sitting right here, has written about very much, this idea that within this kind of regime of electoral authoritarianism, but also where governance generally tends to be quite poor, so the quality of institutions is quite low, that actually when you have policy making in those contexts, it turns into this complex and often very inefficient series of bargains and ad hoc agreements between different state agencies, and then if you look beyond that, it can be other actors outside of those state agencies as well. So it's a messy process. And there's also another kind of aspect that we have to consider is that obviously Russia is a huge country. It's divided into 85 federal subjects, and not all of these subjects are created equal. So there's a great deal of variation in terms of resources between different regions, often actually between different local actors, political actors, and so on. And also, you get very different state institutions for social policy operating at the regional level and then at the federal level. So if you look just within the kind of welfare sphere, things like Ministry for Health, Ministry for Social Development, Labour, Economic Development and so on, tend to be replicated at the regional level as well, and they have an interest, they're kind of also a sort of interest group within this sphere. And that means that they also have a role to play and that it's complex. So generally speaking, in the Russian context, the centre sets the kind of policy direction, and then the regions implement that, or not, depending on how they feel about it to some extent. So there is that kind of split between developing policy and then implementing it, but it means that regions have quite an important role. So I won't spend too long on this, but just to give a very broad kind of overview of how welfare reform in Russia has actually worked. So, as I mentioned, during the Soviet era, there was this kind of social contract sort of idea, but the Soviet welfare system was very extensive, had very broad coverage, and it was a mix of different kinds of benefits and services. So many of these were universal, so everyone was eligible. Many were employment linked, and then some were categorized as well. And it had a very strong emphasis on social rather than political, civil and political rights. Welfare provision, kind of actual physical provision, was linked very much to the workplace. And it had this very interesting mix of both kind of state paternalism, but also universalism. So people did have certain rights, quite extensive rights, at least in theory. Often the quality of services offered was not very good, but they did at least exist. And then post-collapse of the Soviet Union, Linda Cook, who's written very extensively about these processes, splits this into kind of 3 different areas, really. So the idea is in the very early years post-collapse, you get this kind of very top-down, non-negotiated and very radical but very low-quality type of liberalisation, almost a kind of free-for-all of liberalisation. And then the next phase is when that liberalisation process is contested, particularly by the Communist Party, which in the 90s was still very strong in Russia. And you get this kind of pushback from different interest groups, and that means a lot of these reforms actually kind of get stuck, don't really go anywhere. And then the next phase from that is when Putin comes to power, and at this stage liberalisation continues, but it moves very much to happening within the elite. It's all about kind of elite bargaining and interest groups and different ministries and ministers and advisors and so on. But clearly at this point there is still quite strong political will to implement some form of kind of liberalising socio-economic change. And again, Vladimir Gelman and Andrei have written about this, that this was a kind of window of opportunity for genuine liberalisation, which in many respects is not kind of fully taken advantage of. And so you end up with this document in the early 2000s, which is this programme for socio-economic development, which talks about all these things. And again, these are very standard kind of new public management type reforms. So it talks about bringing in NGOs to provide social services. It talks about creating a social services market, bringing in different providers. It talks about competition, and also, again, this idea of choosing, that service users can choose between different providers. So in many respects, very kind of classically kind of impeccably neoliberal document. And it does, some of these things are implemented, so particularly the regions become, get a lot more kind of, well, say power, I don't know how you would put it really, but they have a lot more responsibility for implementing social services, providing them, and some of those, many of those subsidies and entitlements that people had before were eliminated. You also get more kind of means testing and things like that, a lot more marketisation in health and education in particular. But in 2005, the idea of cutting back or turning some previously in-kind benefits into cash transfers actually led to some of the largest protests, political protests that had been seen in Russia, you know, up until that point. And that was mostly older people actually protesting, and this led to the government shifting strategy to some extent, and actually that policy was not fully implemented. Again, there was pushback actually from the kind of general public in that case. And then you see this kind of, again, it's quite a kind of cosmetic shift, but the government starts to talk a bit more about actually the state is responsible for these things, and it does care about people's social rights and so on. And in 2011, Putin made direct reference to this, and this was a piece he wrote actually after the big political protests that happened that year to do with elections and so on. And so at this point he's very much reasserting the idea that it's social rights that matter to the wider population. So the right to employment, the right to free healthcare, the right to education, things like that, and that it's the Russian state's responsibility to restore and guarantee these rights for its citizens. Obviously it's rhetoric, practice not so much. But nevertheless, it's quite a sort of interesting kind of shift in tack. You also get things like these national projects introduced in 2006, which focused on much more kind of socially kind of oriented areas, which don't really kind of go anywhere. But again, it's sort of, you know, there's a lot of sort of rhetoric around this, that the state is kind of stepping up and doing stuff. And one thing that kind of slightly undermines the strategy, at least, is this increasing use of what are called in Russia socially oriented NGOs. So these are organisations that provide particular services which are deemed by the state to be useful to it and to the population. But that's the generally kind of widely used term, socially oriented, and of course, you know, again, it's problematic when it's the kind of state interpreting that, but nevertheless, that's kind of, you know, what they're called. And this kind of reinforces re-centralisation in social policy, in that some would argue it's about the state actually trying to exert more control over civil society organisations in particular, but it also contradicts it, because if you bring in these kind of external actors, you're automatically, could argue, losing some kind of control and ability to regulate and so on. But there are also various kind of other things that we have to take into account. So things like social spending is being cut in the light of the economic crisis of 2014 to 15. That's had quite a big impact. And also there's been this emphasis on so-called optimization in health and education, where you kind of combine, for example, hospitals, you amalgamate different hospitals or polyclinics into one kind of big organisation. Some would argue that that's a kind of necessary reform. However, it has led to a large number of job losses, so that's also problematic. But overall, it's quite a sort of mixed and really quite messy approach, and it's quite hard in many respects to detect a really kind of clear, kind of comprehensive policy approach. And Julie Hement has described it as Soviet-style neoliberalism. So it's this kind of hybrid mix of very uneven neoliberal marketization, but also still retaining elements of that more kind of paternalistic, state-centered approach. And finally, I'm running out of time. So what I wanted to look at that's the kind of probably too extensive background to what I've been looking at, but what I wanted to do was to talk to the so-called socially oriented NGOs about how they were kind of reacting to this policy, how they were receiving it, and how they saw actually interaction with the local authorities, particularly at the regional and municipal level, where again, social policy tends to be implemented. And so I went to various different regions in Russia over the last 2 to 3 years, and conducted several interviews mostly with NGOs, one with a very interesting organisation which is mostly run for profit, but also has a kind of non-profit wing. And then also two with consultants working on social policy, one of whom worked on developing the legislation that really tries to bring in NGOs in particular into the social service sector. And the things that kind of interest me in the context of all of this kind of policy change and so on is whether these non-state actors, and so I've looked particularly at NGOs, but the next phase is to look at more commercial for-profit enterprises, do they actually have any agency in terms of their relationship with the authorities, particularly as the government is trying to kind of increasingly involve them in service delivery? And really what can this tell us about the policy-making process and how welfare governance is changing in Russia? And what I hope to kind of take forward is to look at similar processes in Kazakhstan and also Ukraine as well for comparison. And one of the kind of key findings from all of this was that non-state actors, and again, I've looked particularly at NGOs, but you can see local business leaders also kind of falling within this category, that they actually do have quite an important role to play in governance networks within the Russian welfare state, within the social policy field. And many of the NGOs I spoke to, but also others too, have really quite a high level of participation in public councils, the use of which has been kind of increased in the last few years. And these tend to take place at the regional and municipal level, and it brings together NGOs and policymakers who look at a particular area. So that could be healthcare, it could be public transport, it could be all kinds of different things. But the idea is that they're a kind of advisory council, that they're there to make policy recommendations, but also to evaluate policy too. And of course there's all kinds of arguments about, are they effective? Are they just a kind of fig leaf? It does of course vary very much by the field and by the region again, but they are intended to be these kind of instruments of public oversight. Legally, they're required to be included at all levels of executive power and so on. So in that sense, it's quite a sort of interesting development. And another thing that you see that was very clear to me was that there was a big overlap in the roles between these different actors. It wasn't kind of NGOs on one side and then bureaucrats on the other. Quite often people who are now running NGOs used to work within the bureaucracy. So perhaps former social workers or heads of state social agencies and so on, who then decided for whatever reason to move into the non-profit sector or to set up a commercial enterprise. So there's a lot of kind of exchange between them, and that explains often, not always, but often why they're taken quite seriously as actors, as experts. I guess one of the key things to note is that they're not there to challenge the authorities, quite obviously. They're also not there to challenge the direction of policy, but they're there to provide advice, to monitor policy implementation, to find some kind of consensus on different issues, and also ideally to advocate for the interests of the groups that they represent. And it's really, when you think about advocacy, it's particularly for civil society organisations, it's sometimes perceived as it should be a kind of adversarial kind of, some kind of conflict between government and kind of non-profits, but that's not really how it works. I mean, certainly doesn't work that way in Russia, but it also doesn't work that way in other contexts. It's about building kind of coalitions and so on, and the importance of insider connections. So one thing that is quite clear is that NGOs are often perceived as being able to offer expert advice, right? They really are the experts. Within certain fields, they can't usually influence policy development from the kind of early stages, but they can have some impact on policy implementation. And this is something I've written about with a colleague and will be writing about with Mary at the kind of more federal level as well. So a lot of the organisations I spoke to were very positive about their interactions with these public councils, the role that they could play within these kind of governance networks. So I won't read out all the quotes because it'll take too long, but many of them pointed out that they felt that they'd had some kind of real impact in terms of how policy was implemented. Again, this is very much at the kind of local level, and they don't claim to, kind of influence anything beyond that, but it was quite interesting, and organisations like the Public Chamber can also provide a kind of platform for interaction, cooperation, and so on. Many of them also recognised that, they didn't have as much influence as they would like, and they were very realistic about how things really worked, but they still felt, even when they were critical of these opportunities, they still felt it was better to be kind of on the inside than not taking part at all. So that was quite interesting. And this kind of idea of outsourcing, which I mentioned earlier, has really been ramped up in the last 7 years, and it's continuing to kind of extend and so on. And it's really bringing in this idea of citizens as being kind of active citizens. So Putin has talked about this again, the kind of this very high level, and of course has to be taken with a pinch of salt. But he's also really pushed this idea that actually people have to take responsibility for their own welfare. Okay, so the state's not going to do it all for you. You have to do things yourself, and when you do, we'll help you with it. And that's what the state should be doing. And he's also mentioned this idea of competition, that citizens should have choice between different services and so on, which wasn't really kind of the policy approach before. And you see a lot of these organisations can now increasingly take part in tendering processes. They obviously have to kind of jump through different hoops, but it's being made increasingly easier for them to do this, although I should point out they still represent a very small share of this so-called social services market. So they still don't provide that kind of large an extent of these services, but the idea is to kind of increase that over time. And another thing that was very interesting was that, and again, if you look at NGOs as having some kind of role in kind of policy implementation and so on, is that actually there was quite a lot of pushback from these organisations to this policy. Some welcomed it, not all by any means. Some felt that in theory it could be a good idea, but many felt that actually the policy was still unclear, that organisations didn't have the capacity, that they were not able to offer the same kind of scale of services that the state-run agencies could. Some kind of looking more from the outside felt that actually NGOs but also businesses were not competent enough, at least not yet, to offer these services. And also again, many highlighted the fact that it's about this kind of race to the bottom in terms of whoever provides a service for the lowest cost will tend to win a contract, which is not great for kind of quality control or for the person using it. And often the kind of amounts of money that the government is willing to provide to these organisations doesn't cover the cost of actually providing that service, so there's really kind of very little incentive for these organisations to actually take part. There's also this big kind of concern about if you become a kind of formal service provider and you're an NGO in particular, does that mean that you'll lose your ability to be critical, to do things the way you want to do them, to provide your kind of smaller scale innovative services and so on? And I think that that's something that is also preventing a lot of organisations from taking part in this. And it's a difficult one to answer because people are very aware of how things work in Russia and very concerned about being kind of absorbed into the bureaucracy. And so at the moment, a lot of them were still kind of quite wary about, not wanting to take part in this. There's also, and I thought this was quite interesting, a lot of people kind of explicitly highlighted, without calling it neoliberalism, highlighted this very kind of liberal approach to using NGOs, non-state actors, to make up for the deficiencies in the system, as they put it. And also, of course, mentioning the fact that it was all about offering the same services for less money. And many felt that this was wrong, and one person pointed out that, you know, again, for people who've paid their taxes and kind of be good citizens, they have a right to expect that the state will provide them with certain things, and it's wrong that, you know, the government is trying to kind of offload its responsibilities onto other organisations. And I won't go into too much detail because I feel like I'm definitely going over time. But another thing that was highlighted, particularly by those working more in the kind of social policy consultancy side rather than the NGOs necessarily themselves, was this idea that there's a lot of bureaucratic resistance to this as well. So the very people that are meant to be kind of implementing this policy and kind of promoting it with great enthusiasm don't actually necessarily see the point of it. A lot of them are quite resistant. They don't trust NGOs necessarily, and perhaps even less trust for-profit enterprises. That it's forcing them into a different and kind of uncomfortable role, that they're worried that it's actually going to cost the public purse more rather than less. And several people pointed out that there's kind of real lack of understanding between bureaucrats, officials, and NGOs and other non-state actors. So this is a problem, right? And one thing that, again, Vladimir Gelman and Andrei have pointed out is that if reforms are going to work in the Russian context, you need, you know, obviously it's a huge kind of system with a huge bureaucracy, and you need a lot of very kind of concerted and coordinated action coming from all the different kind of actors, different areas within both the federal and regional bureaucracies. And if you don't have that, then the policy is not really going to happen. And it seems like, at least in this kind of area, that's definitely not in place. So then it's like, well, you know, you're not going to be able to do what you want. So finally, some conclusions that I've come to at this point, although again, very much kind of want to develop this, and particularly looking at the more kind of commercial for-profit side. One thing that seems quite clear is that NGOs have fairly little input into how policies are developed, right, within the social policy field. That is still a kind of top-down process. The priorities are set by central government and so on, but they can have some effect on implementation. So it's not actually as top-down as perhaps we thought in the past. There's a great deal riding on what regional and municipal level authorities will do. So if they're not keen on a policy, then it may just not work. For me, one of the kind of big questions about this idea of kind of outsourcing, contracting and so on, is it really about creating choice and driving up standards and providing great services for everyone? Or, and of course this is more likely, is it just about cutting costs and shifting responsibility to alternative providers, while also perhaps trying to bring NGOs more into some kind of state regulated bureaucratic system? Are these organisations able to provide these so-called innovative services? Many of them have done, at least up until now. Or are they just there to kind of plug the gaps as the state withdraws from things that it finds too complicated or expensive to deliver? And what are the implications of all of this for people who actually need to use these services, right? So again, lots of regional variation, very unequal access, and this is particularly problematic at a time when incomes are falling overall in Russia. Prices are going up, employment is becoming increasingly precarious, people are becoming more and more concerned about living standards and about socioeconomic issues and so on. And of course there are political implications for all of this too, because socioeconomic issues have at least some potential to promote kind of political action in Russia. And this idea of kind of marketization and insecurity of provision is very much likely to continue. And again, what I'm hoping to look at is to compare the kind of Russian case with other post-Soviet states to see if there are kind of similar processes going on there. But I am definitely going to stop there because I'm sure I have been talking for far too long. So thank you.